A very important aspect of lean fundamentals is to understand the history of lean thinking. This is for two reasons. The first is that we do not want people and team members in our organization to think that lean is something new or some flavor of the month. The second reason is that we want people to understand that lean is something that has been being developed for a long time. In fact, some would argue over the last hundreds of years. However, from a purpose of lean fundamentals, it's important to look back for the last century. One of the first contributions to lean thinking would be Frederick Taylor's work and his resultant book, Scientific Management. In this work, Frederick Taylor taught us that there is in fact a best way to do work. And that means that team members need to understand what is this best way to do work. And from that, we create a baseline from which we can improve upon. This really was the initial starting point of what we now know as standard work. Standard work just being some best way of doing something in order that we can all do it that way so that we have a baseline from which we can improve upon. There is no question that Ford Motor Company played a role in lean thinking as well. Early in the 20th century, they were engineering manufacturing systems that were based on interchangeable parts. And what this allowed them to do was to create flow. Even 100 years ago, Ford Motor Company recognized that inventory reduction and speed through the manufacturing process will create a manufacturing process that is optimal from a waste-free environment. While Ford was focusing on flow early in the century, as the automobile industry progressed, it did create some challenges for manufacturing. Those challenges were that the customer wanted variety. They wanted different models. They wanted different colors. This created complexity in the manufacturing process, and it also created changeovers because we had to change lines over from building one product to building the next because of the complexity relative to the variety. Unfortunately, the way many organizations handled management of this complexity was to develop the economic order quantity, which was a mathematical calculation of what a batch size in manufacturing should be based on trying to minimize the cost of changeovers. However, this was not a good move, as now what was happening was we were building batch sizes that were not connected to customer demand. In other words, we were building product that was not necessarily wanted from the customer. And what this did was create product and finished goods inventory that had no place to go after it was manufactured. And consequently, it needed to be transported, it needed to be stored, it needed to be counted, and it needed to be managed. And in many cases, it would need to be obsoleted at some point in its life when we realized that, in fact, it did not and would not have any demand from a customer point of view. This was the first notion of the waste of overproduction, known as the grandfather of all waste, because the waste of overproduction creates all of the other wastes. As the 20th century progressed, another important player in the history of lean is the Toyota production system, which was developed by Toyota in order to be able to manufacture variety and deal with complexity without of the resultant wastes of overproduction. What's interesting about the Toyota production system is that many of its thoughts and principles are based on Ford's original work from 50 years ago that were focused on flow and speed in the supply chain. Taiichi Ohno is Toyota's famed engineer, with being one of the leaders really driving the development of the Toyota production system. There's no question that TPS, or the Toyota production system, has its place in the history of lean thinking, as it introduced and formalized concepts for us such as standard work, quality at the source and error proofing of processes, flow and pull replenishment, and understanding the most critical aspect of lean fundamentals, which is you have to first focus on value of the customer. Relative to the history of lean thinking, it's also important to give some credit to Dr. Deming and his work around quality management. That quality first has to be the gold standard. That if we just make sure that we get things done the right way, the first time, then we will create an environment that does not have all of the waste that is created when we are making mistakes, producing errors and defects, and allowing those defects to be passed through down into the supply chain. The history of lean thinking really got going as well in the late 1980s and the early 1990s from two books written by Jim Womack and Dan Jones. The first book was The Machine That Changed the World, and the second book was Lean Thinking. This is really the first step where all of the thoughts of Ford Motor Company and Toyota Motor Manufacturing and Dr. Deming and others all came together in a consolidated fashion where we got to see 100 years of thinking relative to operational excellence, relative to speed, and relative to business and manufacturing excellence all in one place. And this is really where the term lean first came about. While it could be argued that lean thinking really has its origins in manufacturing, the last 20 years, however, shows specifically that lean is now recognized as a business system. It is now recognized as a way that you actually run your business. In that, what lean thinking tells us is that we want to build a learning culture. We want to build a culture that creates an environment where every day we go to work and expose problems that exist, and then we solve those problems at the root cause, therefore eliminating waste inside our systems and processes, and therefore allowing us to spend more time focusing on what adds value to the customer. Lean is certainly not a flavor of the month or a new program. What this is an incredible consolidation of ideas driven from the expertise of organizations and individuals who allowed their entire careers to be focused on implementing and designing theories and principles and tools. And what we now have is a body of knowledge that will allow us to build a business system that will allow us to focus on delivering the highest value to our customer at the lowest possible total cost.